2023. My riding is the epicenter of the homelessness and opiate crisis in Ontario. The Toronto Homeless Memorial is in Toronto Centre. It commemorates the lives lost to those who have fallen to homelessness. And of course, all of that is connected to what we're talking about today, which is trying to build more housing, but in particular, deeply affordable housing. It costs our healthcare system when hospital emergency wards become de facto warming centres or somehow respite beds. The time spent affording a roof costs families time together, as it also costs parents sleepless nights when their children go missing. Toronto Centre is one of the 3 downtown wards in Toronto, along with Spadina, Fort York, and University Rosedale. And like those local councillors, there has been more housing combined there than all of the MPPs in this Premier in this House together. We have consistently said yes in the City of Toronto to creating housing and housing in Toronto, especially deeply affordable housing. But getting those approvals through the planning process has never been the problem. What we need is to be able to build affordable housing. Toronto leads the Crane Index in the world, and certainly in Ontario. Toronto City Planning and City Council has approved more housing than the developers can right now build. So, getting affordable and inclusive housing approved is not a problem. Getting affordable and inclusive housing built is a problem, and that's where we really need to see improvements to this bill that's before us today, because there's nothing in this bill that actually speaks to those concerns, especially when the government of the day is not at the table of the provincial as well as municipal government to get that deeply affordable housing and inclusive housing built. The housing crisis facing in Ontario is not just about supply exclusively. That's only one factor, and to say that it's only about supply, unfortunately, is a falsehood and misleading. We just wrapped up a provincial and municipal election where the #1 issue is affordable housing. Not just housing, but affordable housing. And so in order for us to really tackle the crisis that's before us, we have to talk about building affordable housing. Speaker, the affordable housing crisis is eating the soul of our democracy. Voters are losing faith in the system and the elections that they are asked to vote in because they don't think that our governments are listening. And given what we're seeing today and the outcome of this bill, one can hardly air them. This government has identified supply as the only source that's driving the housing crisis. And of course, we know that supplying luxury condominiums and building more luxury condominiums doesn't end the encampments, it doesn't end homelessness. Supplying mansions on paved wetlands does not supply families with the purpose-built rentals that they need that are affordable. Supplying developers with an incentive to demolish and renovate their tenants in older mid-rise rentals will only grow the homeless crisis and will not grow our affordable housing stock. Speaker, this government says that they want to build housing, but then they offer no money to allocate to building affordable housing. I think that we can all agree that nothing in life comes for free. The NDP supports building 1.5 million homes, so we have to ask this question. If the Premier is just as committed as we are to building affordable housing, then why is he cutting over $100 million from the province's housing program? $100 million is being cut from the province's housing program. And when the federal government increases funding for housing, the provincial government then responds by cutting the funding to housing. So where does the Premier think the money to build affordable housing is going to come from? But that's not the only cut that the government is threatening Ontarians with. The Premier says he wants to build housing, but he doesn't seem to understand that you can't get it without paying for it. So the Premier also says he wants to build affordable housing now, which is new, especially since now the bill is before us. But the City of Toronto has been asking the province for a number of years now to help them invest in their housing program. That's $23.4 billion in quantum. Splitting across 3 orders of government, that's about $7 billion each government. I know that they have not received a single reply from the province about whether or not they're coming to the table to meet that commitment. The federal government is there, the municipal government is there, but again, this provincial government is missing. So this bill will enable the construction of shoddy homes on dirty soil and wetlands. Let's be clear about what that does. It is going to create massive flood erosion problems. We are not going to be able to manage the stormwater flow as we are building a brand new Dawnland flood protection. It cost us $1.25 billion to get that right. A big section of Toronto will be submersed in water, and that's why we're doing it. Whenever we have a 100-year storm come along and hit the city, and these storms are going to become more frequent, as we know. They're going to become more strong. But if we don't necessarily model it correctly, we're going to have some problems. So by reducing the environmental protections and making it easier for shoddy construction of housing on environmentally sensitive lands, you're going to make it worse. And when the flood comes, it's going to submerge a big portion of downtown Toronto in the floodplains. The minister says that the federal government's Housing Accelerator Fund could replace any of the development charges that are stripped away. So that's one-time funding. And so that funding is actually specifically to, the development charges are specifically to pay for sewers and pay for childcare and other such facilities. It's what actually makes communities livable. But if you're going to take that away and then you're going to actually draw money from the accelerator fund that's coming from the federal government, you still haven't put any money out, except for you've made the cities poorer. And the City of Toronto currently is facing an $857 million budget shortfall. We've already deferred $300 million worth of capital repairs because there isn't a heck of a lot of dollars to go around. You're going to make the situation worse. But worse, you're actually stealing from Justin to pay John. Justin Trudeau to pay John Tory. This bill is about shifting responsibilities and shifting the cost to future homeowners, but also worse, you're actually shifting the cost to Ontarians by also, in addition to gutting the powers of the conservation authorities. Speaker, there's also another great example about the Foundry lands. Some of you may have heard it. This provincial government tried to demolish heritage properties in the West Don lands. It was stopped by a legal injunction and court order. The way the bill is written is that you're going to be able to do whatever you want as long as you want to, and that means that the heritage rules and guidelines no longer apply to you. I get that it was a bit of an embarrassment when the government was caught doing that, but you don't need to go this far because you're actually eroding heritage assets and cultural assets for our future. In a modern era of environmental regulations, chemicals should not be just dumped in the earth, and asbestos should not be used willy-nilly. We want to be able to make sure that soil remediation takes place in a responsible way because we need to live on those lands. Right now, as it stands, once again, the bill is going as far as you can to erode as much environmental protection as possible. It's going to make people sick. It's a form of environmental racism. It's going to ensure that people who are poor and marginalized are going to be on the lower ends of the income ladder, are going to be compelled to live on this poison earth. I want to just point to a fact that in 1958, Hurricane Hazel cost 81 Ontarian lives. It's why the City of Toronto now has flood protections today. It's also why we have that multi-million-dollar flood protection project that I just mentioned. Those 100-year storms are becoming more frequent. We have to build housing faster. I absolutely agree. But right now, the approvals are being approved, the applications are being approved, but developers aren't building for a number of different reasons that are not necessarily addressed, unfortunately, in the housing bill. Before the 1990s, the public sector housing was built. It was also a part of the post-war social contract. Call me old school, but I think that's a time where we got back to the good old days where the government built good houses for working and low-income families. Call me old school, but I think it's time that we go back to those good old days where people who were once living on ODSP and OW will definitely not be confined to living on the brink of poverty indefinitely. Call me old school, but it was a time when we can go back to the good old days when new housing co-ops opened almost every single month in Ontario, where the Ontario government was contributing to that development. Call me old school, but I think it's time that we go back to the good old days where community legal aid clinics has substantially more funding and applications be heard by the landlord-tenant board could be heard in a month instead of a year. All of these problems exist today. None of them are being dealt with at the board, and none of them are being dealt with in this bill. We can say yes to new housing, and we should, with aggressive public investments to create deeply affordable housing supply. We can say yes to new housing by investing in seed funding for new cooperatives. We can say yes to new housing by recognizing and getting people off the street because they require transitional and supportive homes so that they can have embedded wraparound supports where they need them. For people who are living with mental illness and addictions, can also keep them out of homelessness. All of that is not being addressed in Bill 23. We can say yes to new housing by strengthening the right of homeowners to subdivide their properties and make the new units as of right as it is permitted by the permissions. That is in the bill. That is a good thing, and I want to be able to acknowledge that. But there are too many people that are being left behind. This bill goes far. This bill does not go far enough, and where it does go too far, it's going far, far beyond anything that we could possibly ever accept, especially if it puts the environment at risk. Thank you very much.
Now time for questions. I recognize the government side, the member for Brampton North.
Thank you.